Have you ever believed in destiny? That sometimes, in the darkest moments of life, miracles can still happen? Grit and Grace is the story of Mark, a solitary mechanic dwelling in his old garage, and Emily, a mysterious woman swept into his garage after a terrifying storm night. Suffering from amnesia, not knowing who she is, Emily steps into Mark's simple world, bringing grace and mystery to a garage accustomed only to grit and grease. From that fateful night, amidst the stormy Grit and Grace garage, an unexpected love, story full of emotion and unrevealed secrets, begins to blossom. Before we dive into the story of Grit and Grace, if you're enjoying this narrative journey, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories to life. Click that subscribe button and the notification bell so you don't miss out on future releases. Thank you. And now, let's begin our story. A mechanic saved a girl from a terrifying car crash. What she does next leaves him speechless. The inky black night engulfed Harmony Creek, a heavy velvet cloth smothering all sound and sight, save for the furious roar of the winter storm. Wind howled through the skeletal trees outside the Grit and Grace garage, lashing hailstones against the tin roof, creating a chaotic, jarring sound like a battle drum. Inside the garage, the feeble yellow light from a single work lamp seemed powerless against the boundless darkness. Mark hunched under the hood of a beat-up Ford pickup, his calloused hands deftly checking each hose, each bolt. The acrid smell of gasoline mingled with the musty odor of the old garage, a familiar scent that had followed him for 20 long years. The lamplight highlighted the sun-weathered face of Mark, etching deep wrinkles around his grey-blue eyes, wrinkles that told a tale of a quiet life, a life seemingly hardened by time's harshness. Stormy nights always made Mark uneasy, not from fear of thunder or wind gusts, but because the clamour of nature always reminded him of loneliness, of the vast emptiness in his soul that he'd tried to fill with the roar of engines, the smell of grease, the seemingly endless work of repairing vehicles. Grit and Grace Garage. The name sounded grand, sounded fancy, but in reality it was just a dilapidated tin shed tucked away behind the main road, a place people only sought out when their cars broke down or when their wallets were empty. Grit and Grace. Mark smirked wryly, the garage's name a silent irony directed at his own life. Grit? Perhaps. He had stubbornly clung to this garage for years, despite countless times wanting to give it all up. Grace? Mark looked down at his hands, rough fingers stained with grease. Grace was something too luxurious for a mechanic like him. The wind chimes hanging in front of the garage door suddenly tinkled, pulling Mark back to reality. He lifted his head, squinting towards the entrance. In the dim shadows, a tall figure stepped in, bringing with him the chill of the storm night and the damp smell of rain. "Still tinkering with your scrap iron, old man?" A deep, husky voice echoed, shattering the garage's stillness. Buddy. Only Buddy dared to call Mark old man so affectionately. Mark sighed softly, a fleeting hint of relief flickering in his sorrowful eyes. Buddy was always like that, boisterous, optimistic, always bringing a bit of light, a bit of warmth to the garage, no matter how stormy it was outside. "Your fancy new cars probably never break down in the middle of nowhere." "Do they, Buddy?" Mark replied, his tone laced with a touch of irony, but the corner of his lips faintly curved into a wry smile. Buddy chuckled heartily, moving closer to where Mark stood. "You know I didn't come here to show off my shiny Cadillac, Mark." Buddy clapped Mark on the shoulder, a forceful, friendly clap. "Heard you took on another tough case." Mark nodded, gesturing towards the pickup with its hood wide open. "Old man Johnson's Ford. Engine went haywire just as the storm rolled in. He's in a real panic, the old coot." "Old man Johnson's always in a panic." Buddy shrugged, then abruptly stopped, his expression turning serious. But hey, Mark, I just heard on the radio. Big accident on Highway 17. Car went off the cliff, apparently. Raining cats and dogs? Must be real bad. Mark's heart clenched slightly. He didn't like news about accidents, especially on stormy nights like this. It reminded him of the worst things, of losses that could never be compensated for, and just then, the phone on Mark's workbench shrilled, tearing through the quiet of the garage. The ringing was piercing, urgent, like a herald of another long night, a night without sleep, a night that might perhaps change Mark's life forever. Mark hesitated before reaching for the receiver. "Grit and Grace Garage," Mark speaking. His voice was low and husky, punctuated by the whine of the wind and the roar of the rain outside. On the other end of the line, a man's voice, frantic, almost breaking. Please come help. Accident. Highway 17. My car. My wife. We're trapped." The man's voice choked, leaving only a sob and the whistling of the wind and rain through the phone line. Mark gripped the receiver tighter, his heart seeming to skip a beat. He knew tonight was not just going to be a long night, but perhaps a night of destiny. Mark jammed the old rescue truck into gear, tires spitting gravel, as he tore out of the Grit and Grace garage and into the tempestuous night. The wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge of rain, the headlights cutting twin tunnels through a swirling curtain of water and wind. Highway 17. He knew it well, too well. Every curve, every dip, every treacherous stretch of blacktop was etched into his memory. Tonight, it was a gauntlet of slick asphalt and blinding spray. Adrenaline surged through him, a cold fire battling, the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He pushed the truck harder, the engine groaning in protest, the tires hissing on the rain-slicked road. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, his focus narrowed to the treacherous ribbon of highway ahead, a wife trapped. The man's words echoed in his mind, a desperate plea that resonated with a primal urgency. The radio crackled to life, a garbled emergency broadcast warning of flash floods and downed power lines. Mark ignored it. His mind was fixed on the scene. Ahead, the image of twisted metal and desperate cries fueling his relentless drive. He'd seen too much wreckage in his time, pulled too many broken bodies from mangled steel. But the human voice on the phone, the raw terror, the desperate plea for help, that was something that always cut through the layers of calloused indifference he'd built up over the years. Then, through a momentary break in the downpour, he saw it. Red and blue emergency lights pulsed like frantic heartbeats in the distance, painting the rain-swept landscape in stark, unsettling flashes. As he crested a rise, the full panorama of the accident scene slammed into view. Chaos. That was the only word for it. Emergency vehicles jammed the shoulder of the highway, their flashing lights reflecting off the rain-slicked asphalt and the churning black waters of the ravine below. A police helicopter circled overhead, its searchlight slicing through the storm like a desperate blade. Mark wrestled the rescue truck to a halt behind a fire truck, his gaze drawn to the chasm beside the road. The ravine plunged into a black abyss, swallowed by the storm. But even in the darkness and the downpour, he could make out the mangled remains of a vehicle far below, crumpled against the rocks at the bottom, smoke still curling upwards like a ghostly shroud. He killed the engine, the sudden silence amplifying the howling wind and the relentless rain. For a moment he just sat there, staring into the abyss, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He'd seen accidents before, but this felt different, more ominous. Then he moved. No hesitation, no thought, just pure instinct honed by years of responding to cries for help in the dead of night. He grabbed his emergency kit, slung his heavy flashlight over his shoulder, and plunged out into the storm, the wind and rain hitting him like a physical force. The ground was treacherous, slick mud and loose gravel underfoot. He scrambled down the embankment, his boots slipping and sliding. the beam of his flashlight dancing wildly across the rain-soaked terrain. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, gasoline, and something else. Something metallic and acrid that made his stomach churn. As he descended deeper into the ravine, the wreckage of the car loomed larger, a mangled mass of steel and shattered glass, twisted like a discarded toy. The silence was deafening, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the distant wail of sirens. He reached the car, his heart pounding against his ribs. He moved quickly, efficiently, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. He circled the wreckage, his trained eyes scanning for any sign of life. Then he heard it. A faint sound, almost swallowed by the storm, a low, whimpering moan coming from inside the twisted metal. Hope flared within him, a fragile spark in the overwhelming darkness. He scrambled towards the sound, his flashlight beam landing on the driver's side door, crumpled inwards like a crushed tin can. He could see her then, a young woman slumped against the deployed airbag, her face pale and bloodied, tangled dark. Hair plastered to her forehead. "Hello? Can you hear me?" Mark shouted, his voice strained against the wind. He reached for the door handle, but the metal was jammed, contorted beyond recognition. He swore under his breath, his adrenaline spiking. Time was running out. He could smell gasoline, the acrid scent growing stronger. Without hesitation, he turned back to his truck, his boots splashing through puddles of rainwater. He sprinted back up the embankment, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. He rummaged frantically through his tools, his hands closing around the heavy jaws of life-saving hydraulic shears. He raced back down the slope, the weight of the shears heavy in his hands, the rain stinging his eyes. He reached the car again, the whimpering sound still echoing weakly from inside. He positioned the shears against the mangled doorframe, the cold steel biting into the twisted metal. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, he squeezed the trigger. The hydraulic shears whined, then crunched, the sound deafening in the storm-lashed ravine as they tore through the steel like paper. Sparks flew, illuminating the scene in a brief, violent flash. He worked quickly, methodically, tearing away the mangled metal, widening the opening, his hands working with a practiced urgency born of years of emergency rescues. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the doorframe yielded, creating just enough space. He reached inside, his heart pounding in his chest. He unbuckled the woman's seatbelt, his hands gentle despite the urgency of the situation. He carefully cradled her limp body, lifting her free from the wreckage, just as a lick of flame erupted from under the hood of the car, licking at the rain-soaked undergrowth. He stumbled back, carrying her weight in his arms, pulling her away from the mangled metal and the growing flames, just as the engine of the car exploded with a deafening roar, sending a fireball erupting into the storm-ravaged night. He shielded the woman's body with his own, turning his back to the heat and the blast, the force of the explosion pushing him back a step. Then, as quickly as it had erupted, the fire subsided, leaving behind only the acrid smell of burning metal and the relentless drumming of the rain. Mark stood there for a moment, his breath ragged, his body trembling from exertion and adrenaline. The woman's limp weight cradled in his arms, the storm raging around them, and the wreckage of a life consumed by fire at their feet. Mark carried her as gently as if she were made of spun glass, the rain plastering his hair to his forehead, the wind whipping at his jacket. He stumbled back up the muddy embankment, the weight of her slight body surprisingly heavy in his arms, the roar of the exploding car fading behind them. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles seemed a lifetime away, lost in the storm's fury. He reached the relative shelter of the rescue truck, the cab offering a meager respite from the elements. He laid her carefully on the passenger seat, her head lolling to the side, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her face, still smeared with blood and grime, was pale, ethereal in the flickering light of the dashboard. He fastened her seatbelt, a useless gesture perhaps, but one born of ingrained habit. Driving back to Grit and Grace felt like navigating a dreamscape. The storm raged on, but inside the cab, a fragile quiet settled around them, broken only by the rhythmic swish of the wipers and the soft, labored breaths of the unconscious woman beside him. He glanced at her often, his gaze lingering on her delicate features, the curve of her cheekbone, the long sweep of her dark eyelashes against her pale skin. He knew nothing about her, not even her name. She was just a Jane Doe, a victim, pulled from the wreckage, a life salvaged from the abyss. Arriving back at the garage, the familiar clutter and the comforting smell of oil and metal felt like coming home. Buddy, his face etched with worry, rushed out to meet them, holding a flickering lantern against the storm-lashed darkness. Together, they carefully lifted her from the truck, carrying her into the dimly lit garage, laying her gently on the worn cot in the small office space. The garage, usually a place of noise and rough edges, fell silent, hushed by the presence of this fragile, injured woman. Buddy busied himself with blankets and towels, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a quiet efficiency. Mark knelt beside the cot, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of dark hair from her forehead. He examined her injuries more closely in the garage's muted light. A gash on her forehead oozed blood, her arm was angled at an unnatural position, and bruises were already blossoming on her pale skin. She was a mess, broken and battered, but there was a resilience in her stillness, a quiet strength that resonated with him. He cleaned the blood from her face with a damp cloth, revealing delicate features beneath the grime. High cheekbones, a finely sculpted nose, full lips slightly parted in a sigh. Even unconscious and injured, she possessed a striking beauty, a delicate grace that seemed incongruous with the rough-hewn surroundings of the garage. "We need to get a doctor," Buddy said quietly, his voice laced with concern, breaking the silence. Mark nodded, his gaze still fixed on the woman's face. "Morning roads are impassable tonight. We'll have to wait till dawn." He knew it was risky waiting, but in this storm, venturing back out into the treacherous roads felt even more dangerous. And somehow, here, in the familiar space of Grit and Grace, surrounded by the tools of his trade, he felt a sense of control, perhaps, a sense that he could protect her here, in his sanctuary of steel and grease. As the hours crawled by, punctuated only by the howling wind and the rhythmic ticking of the garage's old clock, Mark watched over her. He bathed her forehead with cool water, checked her pulse, listened to her shallow breathing. Buddy brewed strong coffee, the rich aroma filling the dimly lit space, a small comfort against the pervasive gloom. When dawn finally broke, painting the storm-ravaged sky in bruised hues of grey and purple, Jane Doe still hadn't woken. But her breathing was steadier now, her colour slowly returning. Mark felt a flicker of relief, a fragile hope that she would pull through. He looked around the garage, at the familiar clutter of tools and spare parts, at the grease-stained concrete floor, at the worn cot where she lay so still. Grit and Grace. It wasn't much, just a humble garage in a small town, a far cry from the world she likely came from, judging by the expensive car she'd been driving. But for now, it was her sanctuary, a place of refuge from the storm, a place where perhaps she could find a second chance. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently brushing another stray strand of hair from her face. "Jane Doe," he murmured softly, testing the name on his lips. It was just a placeholder, an empty label for a woman without a past, a woman whose future was uncertain. But for Mark, in that moment, it was a name filled with a quiet promise, a silent hope for a new beginning, for both of them. The first sound she registered was the rhythmic tick-tock of a clock, slow and deliberate, echoing in the stillness. Then a faint scent, metallic and sharp, overlaid with a softer, more earthy aroma. oil and something else. Something like rain-soaked soil. Her eyelids felt heavy, glued shut. She tried to lift them, but they resisted, as if weighted down by lead. A dull ache throbbed behind her temples, a persistent, nagging pulse that seemed to resonate with the ticking clock. Slowly, painstakingly, she forced her eyes open. Blurry shapes swam into focus, coalescing gradually into a ceiling. Low wooden beams, stained dark with age, crisscrossed above her. Dust motes danced in shafts of weak sunlight filtering through a grimy window. Not a hospital room, not the sterile white she vaguely expected. She blinked, trying to clear the fog that seemed to cloud her mind. Where was she? How had she gotten? Here, the last thing she remembered was darkness, a roaring sound, then nothing. Panic began to prickle at the edges of her consciousness, a cold, creeping tendril of fear. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain lanced through her arm, a searing, white-hot agony that made her gasp. She cried out, a small, involuntary sound lost in the vast stillness of the room. "Easy now. Stay still." A voice, deep and calm, cut through the fog in her mind. Masculine, reassuringly steady. She turned her head, wincing at the sudden movement, and saw him. He was kneeling beside the cot, his face etched with concern. A man she didn't recognize. His features were strong, weathered, his hair dark and streaked with grey. His eyes were the color of steel grey, intense and watchful, yet holding a surprising gentleness. He was familiar somehow, but her mind grasped at smoke, finding no purchase, no recognition. He held out a hand, his palm calloused and stained with grease, but his touch surprisingly light as he gently placed it on her uninjured shoulder, anchoring her to the present. "You're safe now. You're in my garage." Garage! The word hung in the air, unfamiliar, and yet grounding. She looked around again, taking in the details of the room. A small, Spartan space, furnished with only the cot she lay on, a battered wooden chair, and a small, dented metal desk cluttered with tools and papers. The walls were rough-hewn wood, the air thick with the scent of oil and metal, just as she'd vaguely registered earlier. "Garage?" she whispered, her voice raspy and weak, barely audible above the ticking clock. The word felt foreign on her tongue, disconnected from any meaning she could grasp. Grit and grace. "Garage," he clarified, a faint smile touching the corners of his lips, softening the harsh lines of his face. "My place." He reached for a glass of water on the desk, bringing it to her lips with a steady hand. "Here, drink slowly." She swallowed, the cool water easing the dryness in her throat, a small measure of relief in the overwhelming confusion that swirled within her. She looked up at him again, her jade-green eyes, wide and unfocused, searching his face for answers she couldn't articulate. Who am I?" The words tumbled out, a desperate whisper, laced with a fear that chilled her to the bone. The question hung between them, heavy and unanswered, echoing the vast emptiness within her own mind. His steel-grey eyes held hers, unwavering, filled with a quiet empathy that somehow, inexplicably, calmed the rising panic in her chest. "You don't remember?" he asked softly, his voice laced with concern. She shook her head slowly, a small, helpless movement that sent another wave of pain through her temples. "Nothing. Just darkness." He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful, as if considering the vastness of her loss. "You were in an accident, a bad one. Storm last night. You went off the road." Accident, storm, road. Fragments of words, meaningless shards of sound, swirling in the void of her memory. She frowned, trying to grasp at something, anything, but her mind remained stubbornly blank, a vast, echoing emptiness. Do you know my name?" she asked again, the question a plea. a desperate attempt to anchor herself to some semblance of identity. He hesitated for a moment, his steel-grey eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher the mystery locked within their jade depths. Then he spoke, his voice low and gentle, filled with a quiet compassion. "No," he said softly, "I don't. But we'll figure it out. Don't worry. You're safe now, here at Grit and Grace." And in the echoing silence of the garage, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of the clock, Jane Doe, the woman, without a past, looked into the kind steel-grey eyes of the man who had saved her, and a fragile seed of trust, of something akin to hope, began to sprout in the barren landscape of her amnesiac mind. Days bled into days, marked only by the slow creep of sunlight across the grimy garage windows and the rhythmic clang of tools in Mark's capable hands. For Jane Doe, time was a blurred landscape, devoid of landmarks, a featureless terrain of confusion and quiet dependency. She existed in the present moment, adrift in a sea of amnesia, anchored only by the gruff kindness of Mark and the comforting familiarity of the Grit and Grace garage. She spent her days in the small office, a silent observer of the garage's daily rhythm. She watched Mark work, fascinated by the ballet of his movements, the sure, precise way he handled tools, the almost intuitive understanding he had of the machines he mended. The garage, initially a chaotic jumble of metal and noise, began to reveal itself to her as a space of quiet competence, a place where broken things were made whole again. Buddy, ever the sunbeam, became her self-appointed guide to this new world. He'd pop into the office throughout the day, bringing her mugs of lukewarm coffee and tales of Harmony Creek's quirky inhabitants. He spoke of Mark in hushed, reverent tones, painting a portrait of a man both gruff and gentle, a pillar of the community, a silent guardian angel disguised as a grease-stained mechanic. "Don't let the rough exterior fool you. Jane Doe," Buddy had winked, leaning conspiratorially closer. "Heart of gold, that one. Solid gold. Saved more folks in this town than Doc Hemlock and the Reverend combined." Jane Doe found herself drawn to these whispers about Mark, piecing together a fragmented image of the man who had rescued her from the storm and now sheltered her in his garage. She observed him intently, trying to reconcile Buddy's warm-hearted anecdotes with the stoic, reserved figure she saw before her. He was a man of few words, his communication often limited to gestures and gruff monosyllables, but, in his steel-grey eyes, she saw a depth of emotion he rarely voiced, a quiet sadness, a weary strength, and sometimes, when he looked at her, a flicker of something akin to tenderness. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She felt it, a faint warmth that resonated within the cold emptiness of her amnesia. One afternoon, as Mark was wrestling with a stubborn engine block, Jane Doe found herself drawn out of the office and into the workshop. She stood hesitantly in the doorway watching him, the rhythmic clang of his wrench echoing in the vast space. He glanced up, his brow furrowed with concentration, his face smudged with grease. "Need something, Jane Doe?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. She wasn't sure what she needed, only that she felt a pull, an inexplicable urge to be closer to him, to understand the quiet strength that radiated from him. Can I help?" she ventured, the words feeling clumsy and inadequate. Mark paused, his gaze assessing her, taking in her frail frame, her still-healing bruises. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Unless you know your way around a torque wrench, probably not." Despite the gentle dismissal, there was no harshness in his tone, only a quiet amusement. And then, surprisingly, he gestured towards a stack of clean rags on a nearby workbench. "But," he added, his voice softening slightly, "you can start by sorting those rags, clean ones in that bin, greasy ones in that bucket." It was a menial task, mundane and insignificant, but for Jane Doe, it felt like an invitation, a small step into his world. She nodded eagerly, relief washing over her, a simple task to focus on, a way to be near him, to bridge the silent chasm that separated them. As she sorted through the rags, the rough fabric scratching against her still tender skin, she listened to the sounds of the workshop, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, the hiss of the air compressor, the low hum of the machinery. These were the whispers of grit and grace, the language of this strange, new world she found herself in. And in the midst of the grease and grime, the steel and the silence, she began to feel, for the first time since the storm, a faint glimmer of hope. A hope that perhaps in this unexpected sanctuary she could piece together not just her past, but a new future. A future intertwined, somehow, with the quiet, steel-grey-eyed mechanic who had pulled her from the abyss. The days at Grit and Grace settled into a gentle rhythm, a predictable cadence of work and quiet companionship. For Jane Doe, however, a quiet unease persisted beneath the surface of this newfound tranquility. The amnesia was a constant gnawing, a void in her existence, a blank canvas where her past should have been. The comforting familiarity of the garage, the kindness of Mark and Buddy, they were anchors, yes, but they couldn't fill the emptiness within. Driven by a restless need to understand herself, to reclaim the lost pieces of her identity, Jane Doe began to actively search for fragments of her past. She started with the small office, the room that had become her temporary sanctuary. She meticulously examined every object, every detail, hoping to trigger a flicker of recognition, a spark of memory. She ran her fingers over the worn surface. Of the wooden desk, the cool metal of the dented lamp, the faded pages of the mechanic's manual stacked in a corner. Nothing. Just a vague sense of familiarity, perhaps. A sense that these were objects from a life she might have once known, but the connection remained elusive, tantalizingly out of reach. She ventured out into the workshop, cautiously navigating the maze of tools and equipment. The smell of oil and grease, once foreign and overwhelming, now held a strange sort of comfort. She touched the cold steel of engines, the rough texture of tires, the smooth, worn handles of wrenches. Again, a faint echo of recognition, a ghost of a feeling, but no concrete memories surfaced. One afternoon, rummaging through a box of discarded items Buddy had brought in, her fingers brushed against something smooth and cool. She pulled it out. A small silver locket tarnished with age lay in her palm. It was heart-shaped, delicately engraved with swirling patterns, and felt strangely heavy for its size. A jolt, sharp and unexpected, shot through her. Her breath hitched in her throat. The locket, it felt significant, important, more than just a random trinket. A tremor ran through her hand as she fumbled to open it. Inside, nestled against a faded velvet lining, were two tiny photographs. One was of a young woman, her face framed by dark curls, her eyes sparkling with laughter, a face that, despite its youthful freshness, held a faint, haunting resemblance to her own. The other was of a man, his features strong and familiar, his steel-grey eyes gazing directly into the camera. Mark. Younger, yes, his face less weathered, his hair darker, but unmistakably Mark. Speechless, Jane Doe stared at the photographs, the silver locket trembling in her grasp. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the garage seeming to spin around her. Memories, fragmented and blurry, began to surface, unbidden from the depths of her amnesia, flashes of laughter echoing in a sunlit meadow. The warmth of a hand holding hers, strong and calloused. A melody, hauntingly beautiful, played on a worn guitar. And steel-grey eyes filled with tenderness gazing down at her. The images were fleeting, ephemeral, like wisps of smoke, but they were there. Echoes in the void of her memory, whispers in the workshop, connections, fragile but undeniable, to Mark, to the garage, to a life she couldn't quite grasp, but somehow instinctively knew she had once lived. Clutching the locket tightly in her hand, Jane Doe stumbled back into the office, her heart pounding against her ribs. She needed to talk to Mark. She needed to know everything. The locket, the photographs, they were clues, breadcrumbs leading her back to herself, back to her past. And Mark. Mark held the key, she sensed it, to unlocking the mysteries that lay buried within her amnesiac mind. The steel-grey eyes, in the photograph, so similar to the ones that watched over her now, seemed to beckon her, urging her to seek answers, to break through the silence and reclaim her stolen memories. The journey back to herself, she realized, was only just beginning. And it began here in Grit and Grace, with the silent mechanic and a tarnished silver locket. Heart-pounding, the silver locket clutched tight in her palm, Jane Doe walked towards the workshop. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal, usually a comforting sound, now seemed to amplify the frantic beat of her heart. Mark was there, as always, hunched over an engine, his brow furrowed in concentration. Buddy was nowhere to be seen, a small mercy in her current state of nervous agitation. She hesitated at the entrance to the workshop, unsure how to begin. The locket felt heavy in her hand, a tangible weight of unspoken questions, of half-formed memories. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped inside. Mark glanced up, his steel-grey eyes meeting hers, instantly noticing the tremor in her hand, the heightened anxiety in her jade-green gaze. He straightened up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, his expression shifting from focused concentration to quiet concern. "Jane Doe, you okay?" His voice, gruff as usual, held a note of unmistakable gentleness. She couldn't speak, not yet. Instead, she simply held out her hand, offering him the locket, the tarnished silver gleaming faintly in the workshop's dim light. Mark frowned, taking the locket from her outstretched palm, his calloused fingers brushing against hers, sending a shiver of awareness through her. He turned the locket over in his hands, his gaze intent, studying the delicate engravings, the worn metal. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes fixed on the silver trinket. "In a box. In the office," she whispered, her voice still raspy, barely audible. "Buddy brought it in, with other things." He opened the locket, his breath catching slightly as he saw the tiny photographs nestled inside. He stared at the images for a long moment, his expression unreadable, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the muted light of the workshop. The silence, stretched between them, thick with unspoken emotions, heavy with the weight of the past. Finally, he looked up at her, his gaze searching, intense. Do you recognize them?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost hesitant. Jane Doe swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "The woman, I think, it's me?" The words felt tentative, uncertain, a fragile question hanging in the air. And the man," she trailed off, her gaze locking with his, her jade eyes pleading for recognition, for confirmation. Mark's steel-grey eyes darkened, becoming almost charcoal in their intensity. He didn't speak for a long moment, his gaze holding hers, a silent conversation passing between them, a flicker of recognition, of something deeper passing across his weathered features. Then, slowly, deliberately, he nodded, a single, solemn movement of his head. "Yeah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, rough with emotion. "Yeah, Jane Doe, that's you, and that's me." A wave of dizziness washed over her, stronger this time, threatening to overwhelm her. Tears welled in her jade green eyes, blurring her vision. Memories, no longer just whispers, no longer just echoes, began to flood her mind, sharp, vivid, overwhelming. Sunlight dappled through leaves, painting dancing patterns on a grassy meadow. laughter light and carefree, echoing in the warm air, the feel of strong, calloused hands holding hers, guiding her fingers over the fretboard of a guitar. A melody, hauntingly beautiful, filling the air, played on worn wood and steel strings, and steel-grey eyes, younger, brighter, filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache, gazing down at her, filled with love. A love that felt both familiar and utterly foreign, a love that resonated deep within her soul, stirring emotions she couldn't name, couldn't understand, but felt with a visceral intensity. She gasped, clutching at her head, overwhelmed by the sudden influx of sensory input, the rush of emotions, the weight of memories threatening to drown her. The locket slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor. Mark reached out, his strong hands steadying her, his steel-grey eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Hope? Relief? A fragile, unspoken anticipation. "Jane Doe," he murmured, his voice close to her ear, grounding her in the present moment. "Jane Doe, are you all right? What is it? What do you remember?" She looked up at him, her jade eyes swimming with tears, her voice trembling as she finally spoke the words that had been locked within her amnesiac mind. The words that held the key to unlocking her past, the words that would irrevocably change the course of their lives. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking, the name feeling both strange and intimately familiar on her tongue. "Your name, it's Mark, and I think my name is Emily." Silence descended after the utterance of those two names, a silence different from the hushed quiet of the garage before. This was a silence charged with emotion, thick with unspoken words, heavy with the weight of reclaimed identity and nascent hope. Emily, no longer Jane Doe, but Emily, blinked back tears, her breath coming in shallow gasps, her gaze locked on Mark's steel-grey eyes. Relief washed over her, a cleansing tide that eased the gnawing anxiety of the past weeks. Emily, the name, resonated within her, a familiar melody echoing in the chambers of her heart, a sense of rightness, of belonging, slowly returning to her fractured self. Mark. His name too felt familiar, warm on her tongue, connected to a rush of fragmented images, laughter in sunlight, a comforting hand, a haunting melody on a guitar. But with the relief came a wave of overwhelming confusion. Memories, no longer faint whispers, now surged forward, a torrent of sensory input, sights, sounds, emotions, threatening to drown her in their intensity. Sunlight and shadow, music and laughter, joy and something else, a shadow at the edge of the light, a hint of sadness underlying the warmth of those steel-grey eyes in her memory. She swayed slightly, her head spinning, the sudden influx of sensory overload making her feel dizzy and disoriented. She reached out a trembling hand, instinctively seeking grounding, seeking reassurance. Mark reacted instantly. He moved closer, his strong hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs softly, stroking her cheeks, his steel-grey eyes filled with an intense, unwavering focus that anchored her to the present. His touch was warm, reassuring, a tangible presence in the swirling vortex of her returning memories. "Emily," he murmured, her name sounding foreign and yet achingly beautiful on his lips. "Emily, it's okay. You're okay. Breathe with me." His voice, rough and low, was a steady anchor in the storm raging within her mind. She focused on his voice, on the warmth of his hands on her face, on the gentle rhythm of his breathing, slowly mirroring his measured inhalations and exhalations. Gradually, the dizziness subsided, the torrent of memories receding to a more manageable flow. When she felt steadier, he released her face, but his hands remained hovering close, as if ready to catch her if she faltered again. He stepped back slightly, giving her space, but his gaze remained fixed on her, watchful, concerned, filled with an unspoken question. Emily took a shaky breath, her jade eyes searching his, trying to decipher the emotions swirling within there. Steel-grey depths, relief. Yes, she saw relief there, a profound sense of release. And something else. Joy. Hope. A fragile, tentative joy that mirrored the nascent hope flickering within her own heart. Mark, she whispered again, testing. His name, savoring the feel of it on her tongue, the connection it forged between them. It's really you. It's really me, Emily. A genuine smile, the first she'd seen on his face since waking in the garage, softened the harsh lines of his weathered features, transforming his steel-grey eyes with a warmth that radiated outwards, enveloping her in its gentle glow. It was a hesitant smile, a cautious smile, but it was undeniably real, undeniably filled with happiness. Emily, he repeated, her name rolling off his tongue with a newfound ease, a quiet wonder. Welcome back, Emily. He reached out again, slowly this time, offering his hand. She looked at his calloused hand, stained with grease, strong and steady, the hand that had pulled her from the wreckage, the hand that had cared for her in her amnesia, the hand that now offered connection and perhaps something more. With a deep breath, Emily reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, a fragile bridge forming between two worlds, two lives, two souls, unexpectedly thrown together by a storm, forged in the heart of a garage. Named Grit and Grace, the journey back to her past had just begun, and it was a journey, she realized, she no longer had to take alone. She had Mark. And somehow, in his steel-grey eyes, in the warmth of his calloused hand, she sensed a future. Uncertain, yes, but filled with a fragile, nascent hope, blooming amidst the echoes of a storm and the whispers of memory in the workshop. The silence in the garage shifted, losing its heavy tension, becoming lighter, almost expectant. Emily, now truly Emily again, sat on the edge of the cot, Mark's hand still gently clasping hers, their intertwined fingers a fragile anchor. In the swirling emotions of the moment, the name Emily hung in the air, a newly discovered word, a reclaimed identity, vibrating with a quiet power that resonated through the workshop. It was as if saying her name aloud had released a dam, allowing a trickle of light to penetrate the darkness of her amnesia. Not a flood of memories, not yet, but a hopeful glimmer, a promise of more to come. Mark broke the silence first, his voice still hushed, respectful of the delicate shift in their reality. Emily, he said again, her name rolling off his tongue with a newfound familiarity, a quiet reverence. It suits you. A faint blush rose on Emily's cheeks, warming the pale porcelain of her skin. She looked down at their joined hands, their fingers intertwined, a tangible symbol of connection in the face of so much uncertainty. It feels right, she whispered, her voice still tentative, but stronger now, imbued with a newfound confidence, like a piece of me that was missing, finally clicking into place. She lifted her jade eyes, meeting Mark's steel-grey gaze, searching for answers, for confirmation, for guidance. Mark, she began hesitantly, her voice gaining strength with each word, tell me about Emily. Tell me about us. Mark's gaze softened, his steel-grey eyes reflecting a mixture of emotions. Relief, yes, and joy, but also a shadow of caution. He released her hand but remained close, leaning against the workbench, his posture relaxed but watchful, as if bracing himself for the unknown territory they were about to enter. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts, his gaze drifting to the silver locket lying on the concrete floor, a silent testament to the breakthrough they had just experienced. He bent down, picking up the locket, turning it over in his calloused fingers, his gaze thoughtful. "Emily," he began, his voice low and steady, choosing his words carefully. "Emily Carter. That's your full name. And this garage. Grit and Grace, is your father's. He owned it years ago, before." He trailed off, his voice softening, a shadow of sadness crossing his weathered features. Emily listened intently, her brow furrowed, her jade eyes searching his face, absorbing every word, every nuance of his tone. Fragments of images flashed. Through her mind, a sign with the words "Grit and Grace," a memory of herself younger, laughing, running through this very workshop, the scent of oil and metal, a feeling of belonging. "My father," she whispered, the word feeling foreign and yet strangely familiar. "This garage. My father's." She looked around the workshop, really seeing it for the first time, with a nascent sense of ownership, of connection. The worn tools, the grease-stained floor, the scent of oil and metal, it all felt familiar now, imbued with a faint echo of memory. Mark nodded, his gaze meeting hers, his steel-grey eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "Robert Carter," he confirmed. "He is a good man. A hard man, maybe, but good. He built this place, Grit and Grace, from the ground up. It was his pride and joy." His voice softened again, tinged with a hint of melancholy. And you, Emily Carter, you were his everything." He opened the locket again, showing her the photographs within, his finger gently tracing the image of the young woman with dark curls, the woman who resembled Emily, yet felt like a stranger. "This is you, Emily, years ago, and this is me." He pointed to the photograph of the younger Mark, his steel-grey eyes bright with youth, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Emily leaned closer, studying the photographs, her heart pounding against her ribs. The images were blurry, faded, yet they resonated with a strange familiarity, a sense of recognition, slowly dawning in the fog of her amnesia. The young woman in the photograph. Yes, she could see it now, the faint resemblance, the echo of her own features in that youthful face. And the young man with steel-grey eyes. Mark, younger, yes, but undeniably him. And in those eyes, in that youthful gaze, she saw a hint of something she couldn't quite name. A connection, a shared history, a bond that transcended time and amnesia. We knew each other," she whispered, her voice trembling, her jade eyes searching Mark's for confirmation. Before Mark could answer, the bell above the garage door jingled, announcing the arrival of Buddy, his boisterous laughter echoing through the workshop. He stopped short as he took in the scene. Emily, sitting on the cot, the silver locket in Mark's hand, the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Buddy's usual jovial expression shifted to one of quiet curiosity, his gaze shifting between Emily and Mark, sensing that something significant had just transpired. "Well, well, well," Buddy said slowly, his voice softer than usual, a hint of anticipation in his tone. "Looks like something's shifted around here. Everything." "All right, you two." Mark looked up, his steel-grey eyes meeting Buddy's, a faint smile touching his lips. He held up the silver locket, a silent gesture of revelation. "Buddy," he said, his voice quiet but firm, a sense of quiet triumph in his tone. "Meet Emily. Emily Carter." Buddy's eyes widened, his jaw dropping in surprise, his gaze shifting to Emily, taking in her tear-streaked face, her jade eyes shining with a mixture of hope and trepidation. A slow grin spread across his face, a wide, genuine smile that radiated warmth and delight. "Emily?" Buddy repeated, his voice filled with wonder, stepping closer to the cot, his gaze fixed on Emily, a silent welcome, a heartfelt greeting, a promise of support and friendship in the journey ahead. Welcome back, Emily. Welcome back to Grit and Grace. The garage, for the first time since the storm, felt truly warm. Not just the physical warmth from the old potbelly stove Buddy had stoked to a roaring blaze, but an emotional warmth that radiated from the smiles exchanged, the unspoken relief shared, the fragile hope blooming in the air. Buddy, true to his nature, broke the momentary stillness with a booming laugh, clapping Mark on the back with enough force to make him stumble. "Emily Carter," he exclaimed, the name rolling off his tongue with relish. "Welcome back to the land of the living, kiddo, and welcome to Grit and Grace Garage officially." He enveloped Emily in a hug, gentle despite his size, his warmth, and genuine delight radiating outwards. Emily, still slightly overwhelmed by the rush of reclaimed memories and emotions, managed a tentative smile, the genuine warmth of Buddy's welcome easing her lingering anxieties. "Thank you, Buddy," she murmured, her voice still a little shaky, but infused with a newfound lightness. It's good to be back, I think." The last part was almost a question, a subtle acknowledgement of the long and uncertain road ahead. Buddy released her, stepping back with a grin, his gaze shifting between Emily and Mark, a knowing twinkle in his eye. "Well, you two got a lot of catching up to do, I reckon. I'll leave you lovebirds to it." He winked, then, before either of them could protest, bustled off towards the front of the garage, whistling a cheerful tune, leaving Emily and Mark alone in the sudden, comfortable silence. Emily turned back to Mark, her jade eyes searching his steel-grey ones, 1,000 unspoken questions swirling between them. The locket, still clutched in Mark's hand, seemed to pulse with a silent energy, a tangible link to a past shrouded in amnesia. "You said my father owned this garage," Emily prompted, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on Mark, needing his guidance, his confirmation, his memories. Mark nodded, his expression softening, his steel-grey eyes filled with a gentle understanding. He moved closer, offering her the chair Buddy had vacated, his movements slow and deliberate, giving her space, respecting her fragility. "Yeah," he said quietly once she was seated, settling onto the edge of the workbench facing her. "Robert Carter, he built this place years ago, long before I came along." He paused, his gaze drifting around the garage, taking in the worn tools, the grease-stained floor, the familiar clutter, a hint of nostalgia softening the harsh lines of his face. "He was a good man, your father, a hard worker, honest, respected. In this town, Grit and Grace, it was his dream." Emily listened intently, absorbing every word, every detail, piecing together the fragmented image of a father she couldn't remember, a garage that felt both foreign and strangely familiar, a past shrouded in mist. And me? What was I like? Did I spend time here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her jade eyes pleading for him to fill in the blanks, to paint a picture of the Emily she had lost. Mark's gaze returned to her, his steel-grey eyes filled with a warmth that chased away some of the lingering shadows. A gentle smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his eyes, crinkling the corners, revealing a glimpse of the younger Mark in the photograph, the Mark she was slowly, tentatively beginning to remember. "You were sunshine, Emily," he said softly, his voice tinged with a hint of wistful tenderness. "That's what your father used to call you, sunshine. Always running around this garage, curious about everything, asking a million questions, brightening up even the gloomiest days." He chuckled softly, a low, rumbling sound that filled the quiet garage with a warmth that resonated deep within Emily's heart. "You used to drive your father crazy, always underfoot, always wanting to help, which mostly meant making things messier. But he loved it, loved you, more than anything." Emily's eyes welled with tears, a poignant ache blooming in her chest, a bittersweet mix of joy and sorrow, of recognition and loss. Sunshine. her father's sunshine. A child running through this garage, filled with laughter and curiosity. It was a beautiful image, a comforting echo in the void of her amnesia, but it also underscored the immensity of what she had lost, the vast chasm of forgotten years separating her from that carefree child. And you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, her gaze fixed on Mark, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. How did you know my father? How did we know each other?" Mark's smile softened, fading into a more serious, thoughtful expression. He took another deep breath, as if gathering the threads of a long-forgotten story, preparing to unravel the tangled tapestry of their shared past. His steel-grey eyes met hers, holding a quiet intensity, a silent promise to reveal the truth, to guide her back to herself, back to the Emily she was meant to be. That's a longer story, Emily," he said softly, his voice laced with a hint of something she couldn't quite decipher. A trace of sadness, perhaps. Or was it longing? "But yeah," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering, his voice imbued with a quiet certainty. "We knew each other, Emily, a long time ago, and we will again. I promise you that." And in the quiet workshop, bathed in the soft afternoon light filtering through the grimy windows, Emily Carter, the woman who had been lost and was now slowly being found, looked into the steel-grey eyes of Mark, the man who held the key to her past, and a fragile melody, an echo of forgotten love, began to play softly in the silence of her heart. Mark settled back against the workbench, his gaze softening as he looked at Emily, truly seeing her for the first time, not just as Jane Doe, the amnesiac stranger, but as Emily Carter, the sunshine child of grit and grace, the woman he had known, and perhaps loved. The weight of unspoken years seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by a quiet eagerness to bridge the chasm of lost memories separating them. "Where to begin?" he murmured, more to himself than to Emily, his steel grey, his drifting to the faded photographs in the silver locket, as if seeking guidance from the ghosts of their younger selves. He took a slow, deliberate breath, then turned back to Emily, his gaze direct, earnest. "I came to Harmony Creek about 15 years ago," he began, his voice low and steady, the words unfolding like a long-forgotten map. "Just a kid, really. Fresh out of the army, no direction, no family to speak of. Just grit, I guess, and a whole lot of stubbornness." He chuckled softly, a self-deprecating sound. "Needed a job, needed a place to land, and your father, Robert Carter, he took a chance on me." Emily leaned forward, her jade eyes fixed on Mark, absorbing every word, her expression a mixture of curiosity and intense concentration. She was listening not just with her ears, but with her whole being, eager to fill the void in her memory, to understand the man who sat before her and the life she had once lived. Grit and grace was different back then, Mark continued, his gaze drifting around the workshop, painting a picture with his words. Smaller, rougher around the edges, but even then you could see the dream in it. Your father, he poured his heart and soul into this place. He knew cars inside and out, and he treated everyone fair, customers and employees alike. He paused, a hint of warmth softening his voice. He was a good boss, Emily, a good man. "And you worked for him?" Emily prompted gently, her voice encouraging him to continue. Unraveling the tapestry of the past. Mark nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Started as a grease monkey, just sweeping floors, cleaning parts. Worked my way up, learned everything I know about engines from him. He was a mentor, I guess. You could say, more than just a boss. He saw something in me, gave me a chance when nobody else would." He paused again, a shadow of sadness flickering in his steel-grey eyes. And he became a friend, a real friend. He fell silent for a moment, lost in his memories. the rhythmic tick-tock of the garage clock filling the quiet space. Emily waited patiently, sensing the weight of unspoken emotion in his silence, understanding that this story was more than just facts and dates. It was a piece of his heart, a piece of her lost past. "And you?" she prompted again softly, her voice barely a whisper, drawing him back to the present. When did I come into the picture?" Mark's gaze returned to her, his steel-grey eyes softening, a gentle warmth spreading. Through them, he chuckled softly, a fond, nostalgic sound. "You were always around, Emily, even back then. Just a little tyke, maybe 8, 9 years old. Full of energy, full of questions, always wanting to know how everything worked." He smiled, a genuine, heartwarming smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You were sunshine, just like I said. Brightened up this dusty old garage just by walking in the door." He leaned forward slightly, his voice becoming more intimate, his gaze fixed on hers, as if sharing a precious secret. "You'd come here after school sometimes with your dad. Homework spread out on the office desk. You'd be drawing pictures on scrap paper, asking me a million questions about engines, about tools, about everything." He chuckled again, shaking his head in fond remembrance. "Drove me crazy sometimes, all those questions. But I loved it, we all did. You brought life into this place, Emily. You brought grace to grit and grace." Emily listened, mesmerized, her jade eyes wide, her heart swelling with a mixture of emotions, joy, sadness, longing, a nascent sense of recognition. Images flashed through her mind, triggered by his words, a small hand reaching for a wrench, a child's laughter echoing in the vast garage, a young girl with dark curls asking endless questions, her father's proud smile, Mark's younger face softened by a hint of amusement and something more. And we were friends?" she asked, the question barely audible, laced with a fragile hope, a yearning for connection, for understanding. Mark's steel-grey eyes met hers, holding them captive, a silent promise passing between them. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers, then gently cupped her cheek, his touch sending a shiver of warmth through her. "More than friends, Emily," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze filled with a depth of feeling that resonated deep within her soul. "We were something more, something special." And in the quiet intimacy of the garage workshop, as Mark's words unfolded the tapestry of their shared past, Emily Carter, the woman who had been lost and was now slowly being found, felt a fragile thread of memory, a whisper of forgotten love begin to weave itself back into the fabric of her being. But even as hope bloomed in her heart, a shadow lingered at the edge of the light, a subtle unease, a sense that this beautiful, nascent reunion was just the beginning of a journey, fraught with unforeseen challenges, with unspoken secrets, with a past yet to be fully unearthed. Mark's hand remained cupped gently around Emily's cheek, his thumb tracing a soft circle on her skin, his steel-grey eyes reflecting the flickering light of the garage lamp and the burgeoning warmth within his own heart. He saw not just Emily Carter, the amnesiac woman he had rescued, but Emily, his Emily, the sunshine girl, the melody in his soul, the grace that had once illuminated his world. "Something special," he repeated softly, his voice rough with emotion, his gaze unwavering, holding hers captive. "That's what we were, Emily, you and me." He paused, gathering the courage to speak the words that had been locked away in his heart for so long, words that now felt both terrifying and liberating to finally utter. "We were in love, Emily," he confessed, the words hanging in the air, imbued with the weight of years, the fragility of hope, and the undeniable truth that had finally surfaced from the depths of time. Years ago, before everything changed. Emily's breath hitched. her jade eyes widening, reflecting a mixture of shock, wonder, and a dawning recognition that resonated deep within her soul. In love. The words echoed in her mind, unlocking a floodgate of emotions, of sensations, of fragmented memories that now began to coalesce into a coherent, breathtaking whole. Sunlight streaming through garage windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The scent of wildflowers mingling with the smell of oil and grease. Laughter intertwined, echoing in the vast workshop. Stolen glances across engine blocks, shy smiles exchanged over greasy wrenches, whispered secrets shared in the quiet corners of the garage office. And music, always music, Mark's calloused fingers dancing across the fretboard of his worn guitar, a haunting melody weaving a spell around them, binding their hearts together in a silent, unspoken promise. And steel-grey eyes, younger, brighter, burning with a love that mirrored the fire in her own jade gaze, a love that had felt boundless, eternal, unbreakable, a love that, she now realized with a poignant ache in her chest, had been lost, not erased, but merely buried beneath the debris of time and trauma, waiting to be rediscovered, waiting to be reborn. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision, but this time they were not tears of confusion or fear, but tears of recognition, of overwhelming emotion, of a love story lost and now, miraculously, found again. She reached up a trembling hand, cupping Mark's weathered cheek, mirroring his touch, her fingers tracing the lines etched around his steel-grey eyes, lines that spoke of hardship, of resilience, of a love that had endured the test of time. Even amnesia, Mark, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, tears streaming down her face. Oh, Mark, I remember. A slow, breathtaking smile spread across Mark's face, transforming his weathered features, illuminating his steel-grey eyes with a radiant joy that chased away all the lingering shadows. He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, his breath warm against her skin, his voice a husky whisper against her ear. "I know, Emily," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I know you do." In that moment, in the quiet intimacy of the garage workshop, surrounded by the echoes of their shared past and the promise of a new beginning, time seemed to stand still. The storm outside had long since passed. The morning, sun streaming through the windows, painting the dust motes in golden light, illuminating the grit and the grace of their reborn love. Days turned into weeks, filled with the quiet joy of rediscovery. Mark gently guided Emily through the labyrinth of her lost memories, sharing stories of their past, showing her photographs, playing the melodies that had once woven a spell around their young love. Each shared memory, each unearthed echo of the past, strengthened the fragile bridge between them, rebuilding the bond that amnesia had threatened to erase. Robert Carter, initially hesitant and wary, slowly witnessed the undeniable connection between his daughter and the quiet mechanic who had saved her life and perhaps her soul. He saw the light returning to Emily's jade eyes, the laughter echoing once more in grit and grace, the grace rekindled in the heart of the garage his daughter had once called home. And slowly, grudgingly, his heart softened, thawing under the warmth of their reborn love. One sun-drenched afternoon, amidst the familiar clutter of the garage, Mark took Emily's hand, his steel-grey eyes shining with a love that needed no words, a love that had endured the storm, survived the silence and emerged stronger, brighter, more resilient than ever before. He led her to the center of the workshop, bathed in golden sunlight streaming through the open garage doors, the scent of wildflowers carried on a gentle breeze, mingling with the familiar aroma of oil and grease. He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with a quiet certainty that resonated deep within Emily's heart. "Emily Carter," he said softly, his voice imbued with a lifetime of unspoken love, a lifetime of yearning and hope. Will you give Grit and Grace and me a second chance? Will you marry me, Emily? Will you be my sunshine again and always? Tears welled in Emily's jade eyes once more, but this time they were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. A radiant smile bloomed on her face, illuminating her features with a breathtaking grace, a sunshine smile that chased away all the lingering shadows, filling the garage with its warmth and light. "Yes, Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion, her heart overflowing with a love that felt both old and new, both familiar and forever fresh. Yes, 1,000 times yes. And in the heart of Grit and Grace Garage, surrounded by the tools of their trade, bathed in golden sunlight, Emily and Mark embraced, their love reborn, their future intertwined, their hearts beating in unison to the melody of a second chance, a symphony of grit and grace forever entwined. And that brings us to the end of the story. We hope you enjoyed this journey of love, loss, and second chances in Harmony Creek. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments below. It's always amazing to see where our stories reach. If you loved the story and want to experience more heartwarming stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new chapter or story release. Thank you so much for watching. We truly appreciate you spending your time with us and allowing us to share this story with you. We hope it left you with a feeling of warmth and a reminder that even after the storm, grit and grace can blossom anew. Until next time, take care and keep believing in second chances.